But my name's Matt Igleski. If you or see me the first time, I see a lot of familiar names here. And I'm currently president of the Illinois Ornithological Society for another few weeks or a month, and then I'll be passing that on to someone else. But I will still be a board member of Dunes Calumet Audubon Society, which is sort of based out of Lake and Porter, parts of LaPorte County in Northwest Indiana. And then I'll be joining I should have put it on here, I'll be joining the Indiana Audubon board next year. So I can't get away from being on a board at some point or two. But I also work at Lincoln Park Zoo. So that is why I'm here today, because it's the patch that I pretty much bird all the time. So I've had a lot of different positions. I've kind of been educator, zookeeper, research technician. My wife and I moved to Chicago in 2013. And she's been working in there pretty much that whole time, and so have I at Lincoln Park Zoo. And I also lead trips throughout the region, just some other places I've worked or went to school, in case sometimes it's fun to see those things if it relates to you. But what I'm going to talk about today is Lincoln Park Zoo, and I wanted to give us sort of like a little orientation of this area. So the first thing I want to do is just sort of talk about eBird and the hotspots, because that's one thing that's always a little confusing here. And so on the right, I've labeled all these hotspots. So starting from the top, there's the Caldwell Lily Pool, which I'm not really going to talk about. That's kind of just north of the zoo proper, and that's managed by the Parks District, and that's closed right now during like winter and everything, but it is open during the summer. It's a great place to bird, but I'm not going to really talk much about it. There's also, to the east of the zoo, all along the parking lot this lagoon that runs between Lakeshore and the parking lot. And so that has its own hotspot. So that's Lincoln Park, Chicago-South Lagoon. The thing that's probably the most confusing is that the main pin for all of Lincoln Park, which is like the whole lakefront almost, is also kind of on top of the zoo. So sometimes I notice that hotspot there, and I don't know if people click that instead of the zoo or whatever, but just be aware that there's another hotspot there that could be kind of confusing. The Lincoln Park Zoo hotspot right here, and then the South Pond, the Lincoln Park Zoo Chicago South Pond hotspot. So I'm going to kind of mostly just cover the zoo, the lagoon, and South Pond for my talk today. And so between those hotspots, it's probably higher than this because I didn't go and try to cross-reference, but there's about 210 species observed according to eBird. I would say personally, I think I'm over 200 between these three hotspots. So, definitely doable to see most of those birds in this area. I would say overall, it's a great location for passerines, so our small land birds. There's a lot of cool little nooks and crannies and different kinds of habitat between these three areas. I would say it's an okay place to go see ducks and gulls. I'll kind of touch on that in a second. It's really good, I would say, for views of some of these different groups of ducks, or like different species or individuals of ducks and gulls, but I wouldn't go there to find big numbers of ducks, but you can get lucky and get really good views, I should say. No good shorebird habitat, probably like most of Cook County. You might get an occasional spotted sandpiper or something, but you're not going to get like anything too exciting shorebird wise here. And it's a fantastic place for black-crowned night heron. So if you have not yet visited the zoo to go look at the black-crowned night heron colony, that's something that you should put on your bucket list maybe for this year. And then I just threw in kind of like rarities that have shown up in the past at the zoo. Common ground dove. We had yellow-crowned night heron that hung out for a lot of the early spring, summer last year. The black-crowned night heron rookery. There's been black-bellied whistling ducks and western tanagers down at South Pond. So just like any other really kind of migrant trap and good migrant trap in Chicago, there's a lot of cool rarities that can be found. And so here's kind of like the map sort of showing the separation of those things. And so you can see Lily Pool at the very top there in orange, the South Lagoon, which is kind of that whole stretch. It's about, I think, a little over a mile, top to bottom or bottom to top, depending on where you start measuring from. And the zoo is the yellow here. So the zoo proper is kind of this yellow section. Now here's the part where it gets a little funky. Since there's two different hotspots for the zoo and South Pond, it's kind of confusing to, in terms of like eBird purposes, birding, if you're just leaking, let's do whatever you want. But I tend to kind of just don't tell anyone eBird. I kind of just pick the zoo hotspot, and then I usually generally cover almost all of this in one walk. I mean, it's just not that different or hard to get to. So I usually kind of have all my lists mostly zoo related, especially because the farm technically is the zoo, and that's kind of across South Pond, and then South Pond's kind of in between. But if you're trying to divide this up, and I'll try to talk about these all separately, I won't really talk about the farm, but I'll talk about the zoo separate, then the lagoon and the pond kind of all separate entities. Overall logistics. So I'm just going to kind of get this out of the way now. Things that I think are, first, a nice thing about the zoo is it's very accessible. So there's a lot of paved paths. Pretty much everything in the zoo, I would say everything in the zoo is paved. South Pond, same thing. Pretty much everything is paved or a boardwalk. South Lagoon, there's paved and that like real hard crushed gravel kind of stuff. So almost like diamond dust or whatever they call that. So those paths are pretty accessible. And so you can get around a lot of area here without being off path at all. So if that's something that is something that you are interested in or need, you're pretty good here. Street parking, you can find it on Stockton or just north of the zoo, north of Lily Pool, kind of out by Peggy Notebart. Those are the kind of free parking areas, and those are usually the best places to go check. But it's also accessible by public transit. So 151, I think, the 147, the 120, don't quiz me because I haven't lived in Chicago for a while, 120 something, they're all pretty close. They all get you pretty close to the zoo or right in front of the zoo. So pretty easy to get to. The parking lot is pricey, so you can just park in the parking lot. But the one thing to keep in mind is that if someone finds a real good bird there, it's a half an hour for free. So if you can get in, find your bird and get back out of the parking lot, that's your best bet. I think last year, was it last May? So like a year and a half ago, kind of, there was a Ross's goose kind of hanging out by South Lagoon. So people were able to kind of come in, see the Ross's goose, get back in their car, get out, and then, they didn't have to pay. And it was like really easy. So just keep that in mind if there's something kind of like that you just want to come see real quick. The other thing that's nice, the bathrooms are available when the zoo is open. So the buildings, and I'll put these up real quick. The buildings don't open till 10 ever. So they're always open at 10, most of the buildings. The gates will usually open at 8 in the summer. And this is for the zoo proper, the kind of yellow sections on this map. They'll open at 8 in the summer, and then they open at 10 a.m., kind of late fall to winter. There's not always a hard date for all of these, so check the website or just kind of plan to bird a little bit until 10 if the gates aren't open yet. But when those gates are open, there is a bathroom available somewhere, because there are bathrooms available even outside of the buildings inside the zoo. And then the other thing to note, when I was talking about the herons real quick earlier, that rookery area, the children's zoo, which is over kind of on the west side of the zoo. You can see my pointer kind of circling the area, and I'll highlight it again in a second. That closes in mid-May. So if you want to really get in there, see the herons really, really up close, you want to make sure you're planning that early May, late April, they start really showing up. And then once they really get into their nesting season, the zoo closes that whole area just so the birds don't have people walking around in there. So just to highlight some of the advantages in general of birding the zoo, you get really close observations of many of the species that are there because they're pretty accustomed to human activity. And I'll talk about some of the ducks when I'm showing you kind of my virtual walk in a second. But this is one of them, our beloved Widgie, who's no longer with us. He was there for several years, and you could just get great close views of him, really good photos. It's really good photo ops usually at the zoo. Like I said, the bathrooms, bonus, better than Montrose, right? That place, half the time you're walking a mile to get to a porta potty. Nice bathrooms, heated, all the things. So really good advantage of going to the zoo. If you get really hungry and it's lunchtime, you can just buy food in there, get a pretzel. Plus you have the zoo animals. So, if it's a slow birding day, you still have something to look at. Or like I'll mention it a little bit too, when I'm talking about the ducks area, you got the ducks to look at and maybe study and kind of like get kind of familiar with some species maybe you don't see very often. And then hopefully when you see them, you know, that's something that would be kind of advantageous. And if you're on like GroupMe or any of those things, you can always message me and I might be there and you can just like ask me stuff. So it's another advantage is having possibly someone there that you can just ask a question to that could even pop out or whatever, which I've done a lot of times. People have messaged me and I come out and show them where I saw a thing, you know. So a lot of advantages of birding at the zoo. So I'm going to give you kind of my at least how to bird this area. And like I said, I'm going to kind of divide it into sections like the zoo, South Pond, South Lagoon. So the zoo, when I'm birding the zoo, part of what's driving what I'm like focusing on is just my past experience with where I see the most activity, but also like where I work from. So my office is right underneath the carousel, which is this kind of weird tent thing up in the right corner here. So when I'm coming out, I'm usually popping right out and just starting to bird right away right there. So that's kind of like where I start, which isn't too far away from sort of the main entrance, just to the north here, this kind of, I don't know, little upside down U-shaped building thing. So I generally concentrate on sort of the central and south side of the zoo because one, that's where a lot of the older growth trees are. And then there's also a lot more like kind of dense vegetation and landscaping in those habitats in that part of the zoo. Plus then the ducks and all those things are down there too. So all of these yellow circles are kind of like what I concentrate on when I'm birding. The blue circle, that's the section that's mostly the heron rookery. So that's a good place to go to as well. The caveat there is that if you're walking around and you're trying to do a little route kind of to the south, the only way to access the children's zoo area is kind of from the main mall up, which is close to what we call the West Gate. And so sometimes it's a little just out of the way for me to go up there. So I don't get in there as often, but there's a little stream in there with the bears and the wolves, and they have frequently there's like water thrushes and Louisiana water thrush and all sorts of things hanging out in that area too. Red-breasted nuthatches, I think, were there almost all summer. I feel like they must have nested in that area. So it's kind of nice, that little area to check. I just don't get in there as much. But these are my concentration areas. And so I'm going to try to give you sort of like a little kind of like pictorial step-by-step of kind of what I'm doing when I'm looking at stuff. So this area is an area that I feel like it's neglected a lot. This is the Dream Lady area. And so if you're looking at the map, let me go back just one. It's basically this top circle right here. So there's top circle here. And then what I'm doing is I'm looking back in this area. That little area that's behind the primate area is like really nice vegetation. It's kind of maybe some storage for some kind of outside decor and stuff. Some of the zoo lights things are there, but then really no one's back there. So it tends to be a good spot for birds to be hanging out. So what I do is I literally just kind of walk up to where this Dream Lady thing is to the right. And then I just look back into that area here. So I'm just staring back here behind the primate building. So that's the edge of the building that I'm looking at there. And then if I was like kind of beyond the trees right here, that's the parking lot. So this little stretch of spruces, so these nice trees in the back seem to really hold a lot of good warblers. They hold vireos. You know, I got my first cedron. That was a new sight bird for me this year, right in this area here. And so this is a really good spot to concentrate on. So if you're kind of walking through the zoo, you can go over there. You can even sit on that concrete bench and just like hang out there. Sometimes I stand on that concrete bench so I can see down in a little bit better. And if I do a little pitching or chipping or something, sometimes things pop out. And so back here, I'm going to give you some of the like kind of the best birds I found in some of these areas, or at least some ideas of what's in those areas. So this was actually not something I found, but there was a screech owl back in this area one year, several years ago. So there are screech owls here. Actually, directly behind me, I did find a saw-whet owl last year, like a year and a half ago, I think it was, or more. So occasionally you find stuff like that, but then like black-throated blue warblers, I mean, literally any warbler or wren you can think of usually is going to be in here. Marsh wren I've had, sed wren, house wren, winter wren, everything that likes these skulky, dense kind of things right here. Morning warbler, everything. So, you know, anything you can find at Montrose, you can probably find here. Usually then I walk from there over to like the duck area. So that's kind of like directly to my right from the view we were just looking at. Past the kind of lion area. So this is the duck pond up here. So, whoops, go ahead. So usually what I do is I just stand on the ridge and I look down at the ducks and I just start looking for anything that's different. So the tip here is, one, all the mallards are wild. Two, any of the things that are super good ducks are probably zoo ducks. So like if you're seeing like these nice looking pintails down here on the right, those are zoo ducks. One way you can check is to look for like a little colored zip tie kind of band on their leg. And so if they have one of those, that's a zoo duck. So in here, I literally took this picture today with my phone. There's black duck. So there's a black duck that's hanging out here pretty much probably all winter. And then there's these pintails. And then everything else pretty much in here is like mallards. If you looked and squinted, you could see that I think there's one ruddy duck back here, but these ruddy ducks are also zoo ducks. So ruddy ducks, golden eye, most of the let's see, pintails and hooded mergansers. Occasionally one will mix in that's wild, but then you got to kind of count and make sure you got all of them accounted for. Pretty much all the wood ducks. I think there's one male wood duck now that's a zoo duck, but if you count all your wood ducks and subtract one for your count, there you go. And then the two trumpeter swans are also in here too. So like I said, this is a good place that even if there isn't a lot of activity, to come and kind of hang out, stare at all the whatever wild ducks are around, but also stare at like whatever the zoo ducks are, or like the swans, like the trumpeter swans. That's a good one to get a good up close study. Look at the, that separation. Well, should say the lack of separation, like eye to bill, kind of the way the head slopes, like get a sense of that. So it's a good place to kind of get a close study of some of these like species we don't see that often in the wild. And then that way you're kind of prepared when you do see them. Now here's the other direction. Anyone want to put in the chat, do you see anything besides mallards? So there's definitely a zoo duck down on the left. I'll give people a second. What do you see? Okay, wood duck. Yeah, so there's a bunch of wood ducks. There's definitely two other cool ducks here that are also wild. You got to really stare, and if you're it might be a little hard to see. So there's all these wood ducks hanging out. Like I said, pretty much all the wood ducks are wild. I think there's one right here. And then there's two teal, so two green-winged teal. There's one that's been around since 2017. And so that green-winged teal that's been around since 2017 actually has a little metal band, but it's a fish and wildlife band. It's not a zoo band. So that's the only thing that's going to be a little bit tricky, is that there could be this sort of one duck, one teal that has a band, but it's actually not one from the zoo. So look for the colored zip tie kind of colors, like pink and red and yellow and blue. Those are the zoo ducks. Good question about interbreeding. For the most part, these guys kind of scatter in the breeding season, so we don't have that many of these ducks in here. But there was the widgeon that I had a picture of earlier. One year did successfully hide a nest well enough that no one found it or whatever, and so they did have a few babies. So there are actually two widgeon / mallard hybrids that are male, one female, sister and brother. They tend to kind of hang out together. A lot of times they are in this little section that we're looking at right now, either up on land or swimming in the water. I didn't notice them when I took the picture, and I don't think I see them in there. But yeah, they're in there. Yeah, and that green-winged teal, yeah, also makes its way up to North Pond quite frequently too. Oh yeah, and then I circled that northern pintail that Joe mentioned. Yeah, so the pintail, that's another one of those zoo ducks. So I kind of made them yellow, like these are like the ones to count. The red ones you kind of cool to see, but don't count them on your eBird list if you're doing an eBird list. But lots of mallards. So all the mallards you can count or estimate. And then this is looking kind of north. If you look to the south on the bridge, I didn't put a picture in, but that's where the flamingos would be. Those are also, obviously those are zoo animals, the flamingos, but then there's swan geese in there that are kind of weird looking. And then that's it. So if there's any duck ever on that side of the bridge, for the most part, that's also a wild duck. So if you're looking at the side of the flamingos down to like pretty much where the exit or entrance to the zoo is, any duck in there, you can pretty much always count as wild. And so I have seen like blue-winged teal, goldeneye, some, things will touch down in there for a day or so and then kind of keep going. Yeah, the bird flu, I think what they did is they tried to keep as many of the animals as possible inside. And luckily there was really not much of an issue. with bird flu at the zoo, but definitely still top of mind, still a concern. Yeah. I think they do try to control the populations of mallards. They don't really do anything to the adults. I think they just try to keep them from nesting. So I think they have a permit to do that. Oh yeah, white pelican. Only once did the white pelican make it into the zoo. I didn't see it, but it was in the lagoon. And I'm not even going to give Woody the time of day with that question. So anyway, we're going to move on. So if you're walking, I'll back up a second. So let me just do this so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So if you're walking on this bridge and you keep going, this is another spot you wouldn't go because there's no animals back here. I feel like people maybe kind of walk back here, but it's behind what's called the Foreman Pavilion, which is a place that has bathrooms if there's not zoo lights and stuff and closing it off. But that's a good, this little pavilion up to our left has bathrooms. Another thing to keep in mind. But this little trail kind of behind that goes along where like the flamingos are too, which has this really nice dense native vegetation planting. This whole area is just great for like thrushes and like, you know, little sparrows on the ground, all sorts of stuff like that. Juncos, really, really good spot. The, you know, some of the, and because there's all these like stuff on the ground, often the times I see the Cooper's hawk kind of flying back here. He'll land low, or he, she, can't really tell, but they'll land low in these like kind of decorative shrubs back here. So this is a really good place to kind of focus and listen. A lot of times I'm listening. I walked back today. Here's just like examples too. Yeah, a lot of times there's flickers back here feeding on the ground, white-crowned sparrow. Today I walked back there and I just heard like the little kind of high-pitched whistle that the white-throated sparrows make, and there was a white-throated sparrow and a junco and some other things kind of just hanging out back here. So yeah, this little trail back here can be really good. And then I usually kind of look through the fence into the park towards Stockton, and a lot of times the sparrows like to be up in there too. There's like a little dense shrubby area, so good place to really check for sparrows and things. And then as you keep walking, so now we're kind of looking back towards where we just came from. That's the Foreman Pavilion right here in front of us. The bathrooms are kind of right in here if it's open. But this is like a little kind of, it's actually sort of like a filter for this pond, but then there's often like birds hanging out right here. So I kind of usually give this spot a little bit of time. It's a really good spot. Like I tend to get winter wren a lot hanging out in this area. A lot of warblers, a lot of things. There's actually some big trees like to the right here that aren't in frame. But then some other kind of warblers and goldfinches and things will kind of be out in this area out in front here. So this area right here is just all kind of native plants and nothing else, no animals in there. So that's a good spot to also kind of maybe pish or chip for a second and see if any birds like kind of pop up. Now we're kind of, what we did is we just exited. Oh yeah, swamp sparrow. That's true. Another good one. Yeah, good spot. Yeah, this is another good spot to see things close. Like if you kind of stand there for a second, like around the edge of this little kind of water area, you'll get a whole bunch of stuff kind of hanging and coming to get a drink. And if you're real still and not scary, you can get really good close pictures of things. Yeah, like swamp sparrow that like to come right here. This is looking back at sort of the whole camel, antelope, zebra area is what it's called. There's a whole loop that you can take. Also really good. This side that borders Nature Boardwalk tends to be really good for ground birds, like a lot of the sparrows and things like that will be hanging out. I even saw yesterday downy woodpeckers on the ground a lot over here. I don't know what they were feeding on, but there was like a male and a female that kept coming down on the ground. So maybe spilled popcorn or something, I don't know. But these are, once again, it's kind of these older growth trees that I like to focus on because it seems like that's where the warblers tend to concentrate in the spring. And then even other migrants like red-headed woodpecker. This is literally from this, what was a zebra yard at the time. Now it's the Pierre David, I think, yard. I don't think this thing even realized it was there until it kind of like looked. So, I mean, this was full frame. I didn't have to zoom in or like crop this or anything. It just kind of popped its head back and was like, oh, there's a person. And then it kept taking off, but I fortunately got a few photos off. So, you know, red-headed woodpeckers are a little bit migratory. So this was a good spot to pick those guys up too. And since I've had red-headed woodpecker almost every season, you know, spring and fall coming through here and up in Lily Pool. So, you know, it seems to be a spot where they kind of hang out for a few days. Oh, and then this is just looking back towards, this is the Ape building and the other side of that. Kind of like we were looking more right, now we're looking more left. Same thing. It's just because these are the older growth trees. You can get a lot of good warblers and all sorts of things just kind of hanging out in here. So there's times where I'm just standing in this little intersection for like, who knows, half an hour, just looking at everything that's kind of bopping around here. So that whole area is really, really good for birds. Okay, so that's the areas of the zoo that I mostly concentrate on. So I tend to not even really go much to the north side. I really just concentrate on kind of that central area, the area around the ponds. And then if I have time, like I said, I would go into the children's zoo or the heron rookery kind of areas, but I don't make it in there very often. But there can be good stuff in there too. Fox sparrows, you know, all the kind of normal things that like a little bit of cover. Now, the other area I just want to mention, because I don't think anyone else ever really intentionally birds this. Oh yeah, good question. Yeah, so right now it's mostly been kind of the typical winter birds as I've been walking around, plus the ducks. So this is a good place to get those close looks at those ducks I was talking about. But yeah, white-throated sparrows, there's a few hanging out, goldfinches. I haven't seen any of the other finches yet, like pine siskin or anything. House finches are usually hanging around. Downy woodpecker. There have been a pair of gadwall, but not in the zoo. They've been hanging out South Pond, so I can mention those two. They've been around. And then the South Lagoon. Still juvenile black-crowned night heron. Yeah, I didn't see it, but I haven't really been looking hard the last few days. Yeah, so this area just outside the zoo to the east is the South Lagoon. It's just basically just almost straight up north and south kind of strip of land. But one thing I'll mention is that this is all Parks District. So this is not managed by the zoo. And so this Parks District area has been noticeably getting better to me. So what they've been doing is they've planted a whole bunch of trees, probably like 20, 30 new trees, kind of more on the, I would say, mid to south end of this whole stretch of land. They also have fenced off most of the area that's like a little bit off from right against the water. And so now that's all kind of grown up. So there's like a lot more habitat there now. And this was already a pretty good spot for a lot of warblers and things. And so usually I just concentrate on walking down, you know, maybe one side or the other. If I'm birding like at lunch, I'll usually come out here, walk all the way down south, hit South Pond, come back through the zoo and kind of hit all those areas I just talked about. But this South Lagoon area, don't sleep on it, because I feel like a lot of people disregard this whole area. And this is probably where I see some of my best close looks of a lot of different birds. I get a lot of like black-burning warblers some days. And I'll show you like even these, like check all those little dense areas. There's a Nelson sparrow that hung out for like a week, kind of like hitting all these little kind of really small dense areas down in that area. Clay-colored sparrow. There was a lark sparrow this year down feeding in that area. So I think there's a lot of good birds that kind of like to, you know, settle in this area. It's not super busy. Most of the time people are just running down the path, or, you know, people don't really hang out in this area. So I think it's a place birds tend to settle during migration. And then the other thing is just a little bit further north up on that same stretch is this rowing club kind of thing. And so this is a fence. It's hard to see right now because it's vegetated in this photo, but this is a fence. And all this vegetation just holds birds. I walked up, a lot of times I even walk up into the left here, kind of off the path, and just kind of look into the fence. And I've had everything from hooded warblers to, trying to think, I've had lots of pretty much any warbler you can think of probably in that area. And then I had a scarlet tanager like just pop up one time, like right above me with a good photo op. So, I mean, these little, what I look for, one, I'm just obviously listening for chipping and looking for activity, but then I'm also looking for like those dense vegetation areas. So this is that South Lagoon area. I'll back up to the map. It's basically this, right when you come into the parking lot, it's this area right here. So this is like their little landing that the rowing club uses to get in and out of the lagoon. But then they have a little fenced off area where they store all of their equipment and everything. And so this has a really dense vegetation border. And then it has these really nice old growth kind of trees in there too. So a lot of times I'll just stand kind of here and stare at those trees until, you know, I feel like I've seen almost everything. Yeah, vireos. Yeah, I've had every vireo pretty much there. Good fly catchers, good, you know, everything. Yeah, so that's a really good spot to focus on. All right, so yeah, like I was like, I thought I had a little note. Yeah, so nothing fancy for South Lagoon. Like I said, just walk all the way up and down it. Check the lagoon also once in a while. That was where the Pelican was a few years ago. But definitely focus on that vegetation around the rowing club on the north. That's going to be like a place that I almost always make sure to focus on. Yeah, how do you get to the rowing club on foot? It depends on like how you've gotten there already. So basically that rowing club area is just a part of, it's kind of a part of the lakefront path. So the south part of that whole lot by North Avenue Beach, there's like a crossover. So you can cross there if you're like on the other path. If you came like on a bus or something, you could just cut through the zoo or around the north side and just walk the lagoon there. So Fullerton is the road that runs across the north part of all of this. Yeah, there we go. Now we're back in business. All right, so same thing for North Pond or South Pond. I mean, there's nothing really fancy about when I bird there. It's just walking the normal boardwalk, the perimeter. If I have time, I try to do all of it, and then just check the water and the trees. There's these nice landings that you can kind of hang out at for a second and stare at the island out here and look for anything that's fed out on the island. Think the only, yeah, this is the area where there were black-bellied whistling ducks one time, cattle egret, you know, so really fun rarities, you know, regular things like pretty much any of the herons you can think of, great blue heron, green heron, the black-crowned night herons will come over here and feed and hang out. I've even seen coyotes just like standing out here on logs during the day because I don't know, they must like hang out there and sleep there or whatever. So, you know, there's a lot of cool other wildlife around too. So the water is open almost all year round. There are bubblers. They're not like super strong bubblers, but it does keep usually some section of water open. So that is why it's a good spot too for a lot of birds, waterfowl, like in migration, because they tend to kind of like that area. That moving water must kick up things that they like to eat. Yeah, so if you're looking out here, the one thing I do try to focus on too is this kind of like stretch of sort of like habitat now that's sort of on the other side of what some people call it the honeycomb. It's actually, I think, supposed to be modeled after a turtle shell, but it's the People's Gas Pavilion. Over to the east of that, there's like a whole bunch of land, and that's a really good place to look for some of the kind of land birds. I've had yellow-breasted chat, rusty blackbird that hung out there for quite a while this fall. That was hanging out in this whole area here. Same thing, a lot of sparrows. Orioles like to nest in these trees right here. Orioles seem to kind of be associated with water, so you can often find Baltimore orioles hanging out in these areas. Oh yeah, I can try to show you maybe on a map in a second, like exactly where the pond and everything is. But once again, like I said, you don't always get like lots of a duck. Like you're not going to get 45 bufflehead, but this bufflehead got really used to people, and so she was swimming like 3-4 feet off the path, didn't really seem to mind, and so you could get really, really good photos. So it's a nice place to get good looks, good photos, things like that. I had a kestrel there one time, just, you know, chewing down or chomping down on this house sparrow. Didn't get too close, obviously, but still seemed like he didn't care too much that I was watching him just tear apart this house sparrow. So a lot of good stuff to see around here. You know, it's also a good spot to kind of frequently see like the peregrine zooming by. We've had merlin hang out here for like a good portion of some like migration times. I've even had osprey perched here, bald eagles perched out here on these trees. So like, you know, it's just a matter of being out a lot and checking, but yeah. Yeah, so if you look for, yeah, nature boardwalk, it might show up on the map as nature boardwalk. This is looking back towards the zoo. This is that boardwalk area. Another good place to focus on is this kind of border between the zoo and South Pond itself. So this whole area, I often will have lots of sparrows kind of starting to hang out maybe this time of year. Fly catchers, common yellowthroat, things that are a little bit skulky like water song sparrows, trying to think of else, northern water thrush. Yeah, this is all really good area for those kinds of birds to be hanging out. Same thing on the other side too, this little stretch here. And then same, kind of the same theme. It seems like areas where you kind of have a nice mix of like good vegetation on the ground and like nice older growth trees, especially like these oaks and things. Those are places to kind of just like concentrate a little more effort into looking and seeing if there's birds, even if you're not hearing much. I always try to give it a couple minutes of like just kind of stare, look around, and try to find things in those areas. It seems like that's where the birds tend to hang out. Yeah, so here's like Louisiana water thrush. There's kind of a little water feature down at the end of this. That's partially more for like helping the water move too. And that was one spot that tends to hold a lot of birds. And there was this water thrush kind of hanging out there for a few days. This was like several years ago, but I'm sure they come through and just don't notice them all the time. Yeah, so it's a good spot to focus this little border here between the zoo and nature boardwalk. And then just a quick plug, sometimes there's other stuff too. So there was like couple whole years where there's these beavers hanging out that also got really good looks at them. So it was still fun, even when you don't see birds, sometimes you see other cool wildlife. Like I said, also the coyotes, you'd see them often kind of running around out there too. And that's pretty much it. So, oh yeah, the common loon, yeah, there was one season, common loons, 2 of them decided to hang out in South Pond. It seems pretty big, but common loons are like big water birds. That thing could go underwater by Cafe Brower, which is the far north end of the pond, and you'd be looking and looking and looking, and it wouldn't pop back up until it was all the way down, like on the other side of the pond. Like it was basically doing a whole stretch of the pond under the water, just back and forth. Once you figured that out though, if you just were patient and stayed at one end or the other, you would eventually catch it like pretty close, and they were just right there. But yeah, this is like borderline too small of a pond for common loons. Yeah, good one. Barn swallows. The barn swallows like to nest here. We did have the cliff swallows nest one season underneath the bridge and over by the Grant statue, but they didn't seem to come back this year. But the barn swallows like to nest underneath some of these walkway areas. But yeah, there's just like almost anything you can think of in migration is definitely going to be here. And then anything that kind of hangs out, it tends to be a good place to get good looks at those things that are hanging out close. I'm going to put this here, my info. If you ever want to like email me, message me on one of these things, you can always do that. And then I'm going to put a quick plug in for Gulf Frolic if anybody wants to go, since I am iOS president still. You can look up the iOS website and register to go to Gulf Frolic. It's basically like an all-day-ish, not early morning, but 9 to something. We just hang out at this harbor. You get to look at, mostly gulls, but whatever else is kind of hanging out. And then we usually do a presentation and all that stuff too. So I'm just going to quick plug that since I'm doing the presentation, have everybody here. So yeah, so here's what we're talking about. So Lincoln Park Zoo, I should have started with this if you aren't familiar with it, right here. And if you zoom in, Peggy Noterbart, like I said, parking, you can park there along the road sometimes, or along this whole stretch of Stockton. And then this is what we're talking about when we talk about South Pond. So north of this little weird curve of North Avenue. Yeah, so it comes up as Nature Boardwalk at Lincoln Park Zoo, if you're looking at like a Google map. Kind of an odd shape. And so yeah, what I was talking about, here's Cafe Brower. That little like kind of flow of water is right here. And then this is the island that I was talking about. And then the bridge goes across right here. So basically you can walk all the way around this whole perimeter. If you're already in the zoo, sometimes I kind of cut it short and just kind of come across the bridge and maybe do a little loop down here and go back in, or go out to the lagoon area and do a lap all the way around. So, but yeah, this is like my kind of my tight circle. Like if I'm just going to bird, for a little bit, is this kind of south part of the zoo, maybe part of South Pond, just this area of the lagoon, kind of check see if there's nothing cool in the lagoon, and then maybe go back in and keep working, something like that. Yeah, any other questions? Let's see. Yeah, the pines at the south end of the farm. Yeah, the farm area can be really good too. And so I'll switch it to this layer so maybe we can see. So there's this kind of row of like spruces and pines that go along the south end of the farm. So if you're walking Nature Boardwalk, you can kind of make the turn here. And I do often, if I'm doing Nature Boardwalk all the way around, I will stop here and kind of look around and see if there's any birds hanging out here. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I forgot I stopped sharing, so I'm pointing to nothing. Thank you.
I will say, back to the loons, I was lucky enough to be able to get over there when they were around. And one of the cool things that was just really cool was I was standing on the bridge when I was looking for them, and I got to see them like swimming underwater underneath the bridge. So that was pretty freaking cool.
Yeah, and some of the other diving ducks, you can get good looks of them under the water because it's not super deep in that northern section. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty fun. Like I said, I think the big advantage, or the thing that I think is the most fun about the zoo, is that like you have really close proximity to most of the things when you see them. And they seem to be pretty accustomed to people. So that tends to be, good for you if you're trying to like, get good looks at birds and stuff. Best time of day. I mean, morning is definitely best. I know it's a little bit tough now because the zoo's gates don't open until 10. But if you got there like early-ish, did South Pond, maybe walked around the lagoon, hopefully by 10 you could get in the zoo, and that should still be good birding. Yeah, the widgeon at South Pond is great. It's really fun to have tealy there. The black duck, we always seem to have at least one or a few black ducks that just kind of mix in with the flocks for the winter. So that black duck will probably be there all winter. So and then the widgeon hybrids are cool to see, the widgeon mallard hybrids. There was a pintail mallard hybrid hanging out. He's been there most days, I think. Yeah, they feed the ducks. So because there's zoo ducks in there, they're throwing out food, and that's why all the wild ducks are also hanging out. That's also why the wood ducks seem like they're zoo ducks, because they're just kind of always there, but they're not. They're wild. They just, free food, they're gonna hang out. Yeah, I think like when they feed them in the morning, maybe before the zoo's open, and then sometime around the afternoon, maybe like 2 or 2:30. That's another good time to go in the afternoon, is when they're feeding the ducks, because then they're all kind of like out moving around, and you can usually spot things easier.
So I think I'll go ahead and jump back in here and say, can we give Matt a virtual round of applause here, or literal if you want to unmute yourself? Go. That's valid too. But thank you so much for sharing with us today. I really, really appreciate you taking the time this evening to just share your experiences and knowledge about this really incredible site. And I really do hope people get a chance to head out there and check it out for themselves. I mean, it's an amazing just public asset in general, which you guys should be enjoying as much as you can. Yeah, thank you so much, Matt, for joining us here today. Obviously, if you have any other further questions, Matt shares some of his contact info there. And additionally, we will be posting the recording of this on YouTube as soon as I can, get around to it. But that should be soon here, hopefully by the end of the weekend here.
And I should have said this explicitly, because I don't know if everyone actually knows this, but like the zoo is a free entrance zoo. So there's no, which is also why I think it's such a great advantage to go birding there. Because like if you're just walking by, you can just go in for a little bit and then leave. So there's no entrance fee to the zoo, in case no one's been there or didn't know that. I should have mentioned that. Definitely
important knowledge to have. But with that said, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Thank you all so much for coming. Please stay tuned for future programs on our website. Just keep your eyes peeled. Additionally, if you're not already members, I don't know why you're not, because you get awesome programs like this. And if you are members, remember that we are in renewal season, so definitely get on that at some point. We'd love to have your continued support. But thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Thank you again, Matt. And have a great rest of your evening, everybody. Have a great holiday, whatever it is you celebrate, New Year's or otherwise. And take care. We'll see you guys on the next program.